Climate disruption is causing a rise in extinctions today. But this isn't the first time. Scientists studying geological records have shown there is a connection between spikes in carbon and the past 5 mass extinctions. There is a natural law that the carbon cycle affects the fabric of life. Every time there has been a massive increase in carbon, the web of life weakens and sometimes collapses.
I've been working on the way in which the carbon cycle is associated with the occurrence of mass extinctions and whether the carbon cycle can undergo instabilities associated with it. So the carbon cycle is where life and the environment interact. You can think of it as one grand loop between photosynthesis, which is a process that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and converts it to oxygen and plant matter or organic carbon. And then the back reaction of the loop we call respiration, which is the process via which we convert that plant matter to carbon dioxide. The grand loop of the carbon cycle takes about 100 gigaton of carbon out of the atmosphere and oceans every year, and it returns it each year. So this is 100 gigatons out, 100 gigatons back in. But what we're contributing is on the order of about 8% from fossil fuel burning. It's an 8% increase compared to what is normally going back and forth in a year. It turns out to be more than what volcanoes are putting into the system.
The planet is constantly in the process of rebalancing its cycles, like its water cycle and its nitrogen cycle and its carbon cycle. You've got to think of it as it's in constant flow. And part of the planet's doing that, was to take all the carbon that was in the dinosaurs and land plants and press that into eventually oil and fossil fuels. Over long periods of time, it was sequestered, and we're a young species. And we were curious, and we dug up the carbon that had been sequestered by the Earth. And we burned it, not knowing it was like burning furniture in a house with its windows closed. So what's happened is that the planet is reeling from that. There's an excess of carbon up in the atmosphere. What it's doing is causing that living conditions here on Earth to go out of bounds. So as a biologist, when I look at climate change, yes, I look at rising seas and melting polar caps. Those are evidence for me. But when we begin to look at what's happening to the biological organisms in response to the warming trends, they are already on the move. They're moving towards the poles to get cooler. They're moving from the lower mountains up in elevation, meaning their ranges are moving. They also sometimes move without their helpers. A plant will move north and its pollinator won't make it. This is called, in our bloodless language of science, it's called ecological disruptions. So for me, if we change the very conditions that gave rise to all of this, and to us, it's gonna get crazy.
When the carbon cycle is unstable, it moves into a realm that we don't understand. Going back into geologic time, is that occasionally there are these essentially bursts within the carbon cycle in which things change. One of them, which is widely known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maxima, 55 million years ago. And others, which are decidedly worse, they're destructive or catastrophic events, they're mass extinctions. The worst of them, known as the end Permian extinction. So that's the historical record. But what we're doing to the carbon cycle now is another kind of problem, because now we know what's going on. We know that we have been adding carbon dioxide as a consequence of fossil fuels. And then the question is, does that risk engendering the kind of burst that we've seen in the past that could create what I would call an instability in the carbon cycle? That is one in which small changes become bigger changes. That's a precise scientist's definition of catastrophe. But when you get down to the individual level, losing one's home to a flood is a catastrophe.
We can still avoid breaching that dangerous limit of 2 degrees, but if you do the math, with each passing year of relative inaction, it's getting more and more difficult to limit our carbon emissions and remain under 2 degrees Celsius warming.
Je regarde la salle. Je vois que la réaction est positive. Je n'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
We know we have put too much carbon into the atmosphere, but how much is too much? Scientists have figured out what that amount is and have created a carbon budget that will create a margin for life. This budget tells us where we are now, how much more carbon we can burn, and how much needs to be removed in order to sustain life on Earth as we know it.
I would say the major challenge is indeed dangerous climate change. And if we want to avoid dangerous climate change, so then we have to accept that the atmosphere is, for humankind, a limiting disposal space. So roughly we can emit 800 gigatons CO2 into the atmosphere in this limiting disposal space. And if you take into account that over the last 5 years we have already used 200 gigatons. So this basically means that over the next 2 decades, we have exhausted the limiting disposal space.
So in Paris, it was very important that the whole world and the whole world leaders agreed on limiting temperature increase to well below 2 degrees. So that's a kind of safeguard line, and it's very important that more than 100 nations stand behind it. So imagine the volume that is in this ball. That's a kind of symbol for the CO2 that is still in the ground in terms of coal or in form of oil and gas. So this is the amount of carbon. And if we want to limit the temperature to 2 degrees globally, we may only emit this little amount of carbon into the atmosphere. And to see that we have a lot more of carbon still stored in the ground that we can emit in the atmosphere when we want to limit the temperature to 2 degrees. So therefore the question is, how does it fit together?
So, and now for the next 20 years, this is an enormous important time span to transform our economies, to decouple economic growth from emission growth. And by mid of the century, we need zero emissions. And after 2050, we need even negative emissions. The carbon clock is just informing people where we are now. What is the pathway, how we exhaust the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere. And this is a huge challenge for humankind.
Science tells us that our current climate crisis is a problem we've created, but it is also a problem we can fix. Not only do we need to stop emitting carbon at the current levels by switching to renewable energy, but it is also critical to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Climate change can be reversed if we act now. Recently, researchers have figured out what solutions can draw carbon down, getting us back to pre-industrial levels.
There's only 2 things you can do about the atmosphere. You can either stop putting greenhouse gases up there, or you can bring CO2 back down. That's it. And you can do the first one by conservation, energy efficiency, and clean energy. And the second one through photosynthesis, whether it's on land, on farms, on forests, phytoplankton, kelp in the oceans. There's only 2 things you can do. So that actually sorts it pretty simply. And in the past, what has been done in terms of solutions is that it's focused on energy. Energy, energy, energy. And the reason for that is understandable. So it makes perfect sense to say, well, let's stop putting that CO2 up there. Accepting that in the process of emphasizing clean energy, renewable energy, solar, wind, etc., it sort of occluded the rest of the solutions. The purpose of drawdown was to see if the 80 solutions that we had modeled would scale to the point where we could reverse global warming within 30 years, going from reduce to reverse. You bend the carbon curve, what drawdown shows is that we have choices. And that if we increase the rate that we're scaling some of the solutions, then we can achieve drawdown at 2050. And if you say the odds are long, I agree. They're long odds. I'll take them.
My name is Linwood Gill. I'm the Chief Forester for the USAL Redwood Forest Company. USAL Redwood Forest is a community forest. It's owned by a nonprofit, the Redwood Forest Foundation. It's a 50,000-acre forest which is dedicated to managing the forest on a long-term basis for the economic stability of the community, as well as restoring the forest habitat, restoring the fish habitat, and also for sequestering carbon. And carbon sequestration is a main part of our operations right now. Carbon sequestration is an important part of combating climate change. The USAL Redwood Forest is a very young redwood forest, and redwoods can absorb more carbon than any other forest type on the planet. Redwoods store carbon by absorbing carbon from carbon dioxide out of the air into its needles and stores it into the bole of the tree, the trunk, or the roots, the branches. To my knowledge, this is one of the largest carbon projects in the country. Yes.
I am the biochar project manager for the Redwood Forest Foundation. We're sort of at a perfect storm right now in California, where we have over 100 million dead trees in the Sierra, and we need to do something with that.
We have what is called the western pine bark beetle, which makes its living by feeding on ponderosa pine and other trees as well. And these beetles have been around for thousands of years and have lived in harmony and balance with the trees. But unfortunately, because of climate change and because of the long drought, millions of trees are very weak and have difficulty defending themselves against the beetles.
Biochar can definitely be one of the ways that we address the beetle damage in the dead and dying trees in the Sierras. Biochar is essentially the form of charcoal that is suitable for use in agriculture and in helping to build more healthy soils. When you pyrolyze woody biomass particularly, about half of the carbon that is in that woody biomass can be saved as a residual charcoal. And biochar is very much like coral for the soil in that it can hold nutrients, it can hold water. It's more of an architecture. It incubates life. You're saving about half of the carbon that's in that plant and then can put it to better use and sequestering it in soil for great benefit to agriculture. We have all this biomass that we have to do something with.
They are a fire hazard, and as you know, right now we have something like 10 fires in California. And by producing biochar, we can return some of that material back into the forest in a safe manner, or we can take some of that biochar and take it down into the Central Valley, which desperately needs water savings. And one of the prime benefits of biochar is that it can help to retain water in soils.
If we put biochar in just 10% of the world's soils, we'll actually sequester 29 billion tons of CO2. 29 billion tons, that's on 10%. And that's using only quote unquote surplus waste material. So that's significant.
And then we have the carbon offset credits. And to keep those carbon credits coming, we have to employ workers to do our forest inventories, to work with the carbon verifiers to make sure the carbon that we say is on the property, and then is maintained into the future. I'd like to think that we're a model that others can join in and do the same thing that we're doing out here. This isn't rocket science. The carbon storage as we move into the future is huge, and we need more larger, older forest, intact forest that we know will never be developed and can continue into perpetuity.
I'm Kate Scow, and I'm a professor in land, air, and water resources at University of California, Davis. And I'm a soil microbial ecologist. So the carbon cycle on a global scale involves aquatic systems and terrestrial systems. So soil is a very important part of the terrestrial systems. Soil actually contains 2 to 3 times the amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere. Soil is the place where primary productivity is supported. That means all the vegetation that grows, that fixes CO2 through photosynthesis from the atmosphere. What miraculous, like creating mass here on the ground out of what? Air? It's like still amazing to me. That productivity brings all this carbon in. The plant fixes the CO2, it dies, it falls onto the ground, and all that plant residue now enters into the soil carbon cycle. It's way bigger than the atmosphere, what is residing in soil. So organic farms obtain their nutrients not from synthetic fertilizers. The fertilizer is in the form of organic material. That could be cover crops, or it could be compost that's made of food wastes or yard waste or animal waste that you put in the soil. So in organic systems, you may be putting up to 8 times as much carbon into the soil compared to a conventional system. So it's like part of it is really basic.
Climate change gives us an opportunity to really behave differently on this planet. We see what we can do at our worst. And now the question is, if we were to consciously be a part of the healing, it'll unleash, I think, our creativity. You realize, oh my gosh, I have a backyard. Oh my gosh, I have a park near me. If we were to see ourselves as helpers who could help the helpers heal this planet, that is so much better than seeing ourselves as disruptive toddlers with matches. You begin to realize that all of us are somehow connected to little bits of the solution.
This is right now, we live and direct at my mentor's house, the OG, the organic gardener, Ron Finley. I'm more inspired to always come here and learn and figure out different ways of how I can actually utilize a small plot of land to grow the most that I can. Culinary climate action is basically what I like to see when I'm growing the food, and it's basically taking all that carbon out the atmosphere, it's pulling it in, and we also can see the fact that we can put it back into the soil. Not only as at the same time it's creating green jobs, you know, and also addressing things like diabetes and obesity in my community where I come from. You know, there's a lot of plots, there's a lot of city access, there's a lot of water that's available. This is really just it's a beautiful cause and effect. We're literally pulling out all the harmful poisons that we literally just emit into our atmosphere. And the best way that you want to transform that is by growing some food, put it on the roof, put it in your windowsill. But we feel the heat rising. You know, being a farmer is being futuristic. There is no doomsday mentality. You have to actually plant water and think that you're gonna reap what you sow. So that's the conversation that I like to see. And, you know, when we're talking about transforming the climate, it's not gonna happen overnight, but you do have to start now. Now's the time.